Okay, let's start. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Engineer Joshua C. Agar, an assistant professor from the Institute of Civil Engineering. I thank you all for attending this brief lecture. So, hopefully brief yung I'll be giving a brief explanation. But since this is quite a broad topic, I might sideline myself into many segues. Hopefully I get out of that habit as I present this presentation. So this will be actually a preview of what I'll be presenting on the December 11th, I think, on the as a plenary speaker to uh, the convention conducted by the Honor Society of Mapua. And I'll be also presenting more the technical details on the incoming environmental engineering conference, maybe next year, if in case the paper will be accepted. The paper submission is accepted. So again, without further ado, let's delve into the brief explanation. So the outline is mainly divided into two. So we have the aerodynamics of phase shields against sporadic emissions, and again, uh, the aerodynamics of phase shields against non-sporadic emissions. So the main difference between those two is that for sporadic emissions, uh, they they are caused by short-term and quite violent releases, or rather they have high momentum the moment they were released. So for example, sneezes go about 100 miles per hour while coughs go about 55 miles per hour. However, for non-sporadic emissions, we'll be considering, for example, breathing, speaking, or shouting. So those types of aerosol generating procedures that most medical professionals have forgot in considering what or forgot when they attempt to understand that COVID-19 is air. So we begin with the solution schematic. So we go straight away to what I've done. So basically, I did a computational fluid dynamics. So CFD for short is the numerical analysis of wind flow. So using computational assistance, I simulated wind flows. So we have a setup here. So there's a source box introducing the sporadic emission cup or sneeze. Then there's a dummy head on the end of the line. And supposedly there are two cases, one scenario where the person is not protected by a face shield or an and rather, and the scenario where the person itself is exposed to the said sporadic emissions. And apart from that, the sporadic emissions are coming from different angles of attack. So not only that the cough or sneeze are coming from the front, we'll be also evaluating what happens if the cough is coming from the sides, coming from the back. So this on the left, on the right is the discretization procedure. So we subdivide the said computational domain into finite volumes. Then this is the result. This is your computational grid. Then as we move closer to the surfaces, as you will notice, the surfaces or the grid gets finer as we move as we approach the high resolution region. So the region where we have to, or that's required, the region of the flow that is required for you to allot more computational resources. So the simulation parameter, so the simulation is an unsteady state analysis. So when dealing with unsteady state analysis, we'll be also considering the transient effects. So for example, eddies, or eddies are, the other term for eddies are unsteady vortices. So vortices that has a time period of existence. So it appears, then it diminishes over time. It has certain, as eddies were soon to be defined in the energy cascade theory, eddies have length scale and they have also time scale. So they have size and they have time of existence. So the turbulence model, so in modeling the turbulence, we shift from the traditional Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equation where we resolve uh, the turbulent effects to be just additional shear stresses into large eddy simulation where we treat the turbulence to its true nature, which is the superimposition of eddies. So we model the small eddies while we resolve the large eddies in large eddy simulation. And we'll be using the one equation turbulence model proposed by Yu and Moyne in 2007. So the LES model was first proposed by Smagorinsky in 1963. That's why I mentioned this author. Uh, this was a great contribution actually. And of course, the study by Kolmogorov in 1941, which attacked the turbulence statistically. So he defined he defined eddies of many sizes. He conducted spatial analysis. He implemented low pass filters, and he determined that the energy carried by the turbulent flow is being cascaded across different eddies of different sizes. And to resolve the smaller eddies, since we mentioned that the eddies have a time scale and a length scale, so smaller eddies tend to have smaller time scales. So in order to accurately model those small eddies, we'll be having a time step of 0.001 meters per second, which is quite small when compared to runs, where a time step of 1 second will be allowed. Since in runs, we'll be dealing, the applications is more inclined to evaluating the wind pressures or the fluid pressures rather than the unsteady effects themselves. So mainly for aerodynamics purposes, if we're dealing with runs calculations. So the distance from the source in the case of sporadic emissions will be 1 meter. And what to look out for? So in the analysis, of course, there's many uncertainties. Nature of the cuff, it's much different. So we tend to evaluate the aerodynamic performance of the said face shield and the face as black bodies alone. So what to look out for when analyzing these, when inferring to the results? First is the negative pressures. So the mere existence of negative pressure would result to pressure diffusion. So apart from the innate nature of airborne particles to go from regions of higher concentration to regions of lower concentration, the airborne particles also have that tendency to go, not only airborne particles, but rather parcels of air, for example, or momentum itself shifts from regions of higher pressure to regions of lower pressure. That's how pressure and flow velocity are actually related in this manner. So another thing to look out for is the jet. So when the emission is still in its jet phase, so we have to distinguish the transition between jet. Then eventually after it travels some distance, it diffuses more, it becomes what's called plumes. So jets are high velocity flows that possibly carry the heavier droplets, since there's high flow energy and it feeds to the projectile motion of the said heavy droplets, which can be worrisome when it gets to the ice, as the droplet experts, droplet topologists have proclaimed, as the pathway for infection. So if it gets to the ice, there's a chance that we might be infected with COVID-19 in this scenario. Another thing to consider are the reverse flow. So I mentioned previously that the negative pressures not only attracts the airborne particles, but it also attracts the air itself. So it redirects the flow, the wind direction, the flow of air towards the center of that negative pressure region. So the simulation results for the sporadic emissions, as we snip or as we analyze each of the time history. So if there's an incoming cuff, so incoming cuff over here, so we recorded high velocity over there. So what happens is that the incoming air from the emission pushes the other air away. So it's incoming, so there's a burst of positive pressure over here. So also if you look from above, it's the same scenario. And what follows the positive pressure, in order to maintain equilibrium, there has to be a throw. So a throw of negative pressures, so that the what was being carried by that emission or by that incoming air will be still sandwiched between those two regions. So it just moves across space along with the said incoming air. That's how to balance. That's how actually fluid flow works. After it hits the black body, so for example, the face shield, what happens is that most of the positive pressure will be pressed upon the front of the face shield. Meanwhile, the negative pressure travels across, then it actually lingers to the opposite side to maintain equilibrium. So to maintain the said equilibrium, there has to be a positive pressure here, a positive pressure over there, a positive pressure over there, and eventually the positive pressure will come across here to sandwich the said negative pressure region to maintain equilibrium at all aspects. And if we look into the top view, you can see that the blue region, so this indicates the peak negative pressure, how they call this, uh, not actually enters but manifested in the air between the face and the face shield, therefore attracting what's called the the smaller droplets, which act more as aerosols rather than projectiles. So this reflects to what Akagi and his colleagues, so Hisao and Araga, if I remember correctly, from the Fukuoka University, where he observed, where they observed vortex rings, which carries the some of the airborne particles from the emissions themselves by the moment of impact. Lindsley, on the other hand, in his experimental procedure, since there's a limitations in resolving or simulating turbulence in that kinds of scenarios, especially in the experimental procedures, the recirculation was only observed moments after impact. But in Akagi's research, it was during impact that the vortex rings have manifested. And again, when the simulations or the results from Akagi and his colleagues were replicate or redone, the same phenomenon was observed. So there's consistency in the physics. Another thing to consider, since most of the studies deal with the frontal emission, so we're dealing with face shields in hospital settings, since patients tend to especially during intubation procedures, they don't wear any mask. Therefore, there are tendencies of sporadic emissions, cups or sneezes being introduced directly into the air. And sadly, if the healthcare workers on the way, of course, said healthcare worker has to be protected. Hence, the justification of face shields in hospital settings. However, since what the healthcare workers are dealing with are emissions coming from the front, so they are frontally tending the patient, and suddenly the patient coughs or sneezes. So they, in their perspective, that's only the kind of scenario that they are at most they are subjected to the most risk. Therefore, most of the conceived studies concerning sporadic emissions only deal with the frontal emissions. However, if we consider the other angles of attacks, for example, uh, if the user is partially facing sideways, then there's an incoming sporadic emission. Some of the jet will be directed to the face, so there's the protection becomes moot. So moot, so not smooth. And of course, if you're facing from the side, since the face shield is on the front, there's no action, there's no protection at all. What's worse is when the emissions are coming from the back. So instead of the emissions just breezing past you, so if the emissions are coming from the back, then what happens supposedly without face shields is that the said jet will just breezes over you. However, with the mere existence of the face shield itself causes actually the said jet to be redirected towards your face. So you're more even though in summary for sporadic emissions, even though you're protected, it offers protection from frontal emissions, uh, some discretionary measures, some discretion. So despite being protected from the larger droplets, face shields cannot protect the healthcare workers from the smaller droplets, which lingers longer in the air. Hence, apart from the face shields, there are more equipment that the healthcare workers need to equip themselves with. So there's hazmat, there's goggles, there's face masks. So in conjunction, the usage of face shields in hospital settings should be used in conjunction uh, to this apparatus. However, of course, when the if we introduce, for example, face shields in public settings, they do not offer the same protection that uh, experts supposedly claim when in hospital settings. So in public settings, things are much different. So not only that the people wearing it are not only exposed to the frontal emissions, but they are also exposed by the said angles of mentioned angles of attack, which in turn increase the risk of infection. So if we look to the streamlines, of course, you can see the said vortex rings, which carry the some of the smaller aerosols. So there's vortex ring here, there's vortex ring here. In Akagi's research, since the user was somehow facing upwards, so the face shield is oriented at an inclined angle, so the vortex ring is observed at the bottom. So this is the view from above. So you can see the vortex here, this swirling portion here. And if we look from this one is with concerns to no, rather the front view when the time history of the streamlines of sporadic emissions. So this is the visualization full glory. So quite chaotic after impact. So you can see there's recirculating air over there. So we're now after sporadic emission. So we identified the limitations of the face shields. So you have to only wear it when dealing with infected patients against sporadic emissions with frontally treating them. But for other angles of attacks, face shields actually offer little to no protection, but rather aggravates your situation. And we now move on to the non-sporadic emissions, which were not previously considered. Uh, and of course, the mere fact that the moment you're wearing the mask, face mask, surgical mask, or N95 mask, you're already eliminating the chances of sporadic emissions being directly introduced into the air. Therefore, what the remaining concern here is the non-sporadic emissions, or rather the emissions that are introduced in low momentum scenarios. So the airborne droplets are diffusing from the mass, for example, so they accumulate in the air, they linger longer in the air. So in ambient conditions, Dr. Jerry Bagtasa from the UP Institute of Environmental Science and Meteorology already evaluated, considering that COVID-19 is airborne, that face shields offer no protection in both indoor and outdoor settings. So if the person is stationary in both indoor and outdoor settings, face shields are determined to offer no protection. So this conference paper was presented in the proceedings of Samahan ng or Proceedings of the Physics Society of the Philippines. So I just translated that to English. What I've considered in the series of the simulations that I've done is, what if there's movement? So if the wearer of the face shield is moving across space, or sadly if the wearer of the face shield is moving across contaminated space, and what if there's air blowing towards a person's face? So the moment of impact or moment of impact of the incoming air, for example, from the electric fan, or the moment you begin your movement, at the onset of movement, this is what happens. So there's a negative pressure region, or a negative pressure region situated around this area. Of course, the flow is not yet going towards it, but rather that's where the flow is subsequently attracted to as time goes on. In contrast, if you're not wearing face shield, the said negative pressure will be situated at the back of the head. So that's a basic principle of black body aerodynamics. If there's a black body being exposed to the or being subjected or placed on a flow field, what happens is that the separation actually brings a positive pressure region and a negative pressure region. The positive pressure region is always situated at the windward side, so the one facing the incoming air. On the other hand, the negative pressure region is always situated at the leeward side, so the one that's facing away from the air. So if there are no face shields, so the positive pressure region will be your face, so that's actually good. And the negative pressure region would, or the leeward side, would be the back of your head. But if you put face shields, for example, the positive pressure region will be the front of the face shield, and sadly, the negative pressure region, which is at the uh, leeward side, will be the other inside face of the face shield, along with your face. So by putting on face shields, you're actually subjecting yourselves to the said negative pressure region. And this is what happens. So apart from the said suction effect, so there's negative pressure within the face shield. There's also this thing called mixing layer. So the development of that mixing layer. So the flow recirculates, then reattaches itself to the main flow over time. So this is 0.01 seconds, then 0.16 seconds, 0.34 seconds, and 0.61 seconds. And as you can see, there's interaction between the inside and the outside. So what are the implications of this? So the mixing layer actually causes inhomogeneity of the humidity between the face and the face shield, where the moist air, which is within your face, meets the dry air outside. If you take note, in air-conditioned areas, air conditioners tend to remove the moisture from the air itself. So what the air conditioners are actually emitting or blowing are dry and cold air. So the dry air mixes with the humid air, which actually causes, so if we play, this is the development of the mixing layer in full glory, visualization of that, and meets the dry air from the dry air conditioned air outside. And what's actually observed by the previous researchers is if there's inhomogeneity in the humidity, so there's high relative humidity, what happens is that evaporation rate increases. So as evaporation rate increases, the droplets reduce in size. And since they're smaller in size, they can become more diffusive, and they have, since they became lighter, they are more subjected or carried more by the convective effects. And the convective effects, if the said droplet evaporated and is still situated in the region between the face and the face shield, the convective patterns actually doesn't allow the the said airborne particle to not exceed the said region, so the region between the face and the face shield. So it keeps accumulating, it keeps being held there. So while also while also the said convective transport and the negative pressure region attracts more out airborne particles. So in turn, there's the accumulation happening here, and what are actually accumulating is the droplets that have evaporated. And what happens when the droplets evaporate? So the hydrogen atoms which are present in the said droplets are retained. However, since the volume decreases, so what happens is that the concentration in turn, so the pH levels decreases. So take note, if the pH level decrease, meaning there's high acidity. If the pH level increase, that means that it's more leaning towards the basic side of the spectrum. And if we take note, the surface area of the sphere is given by this equation. The volume of the sphere is also given by the equation. If we take the surface area to volume ratio, we arrive at this equation. So it's actually inversely proportional to the radius. So uh, as droplets get smaller, what happens is that uh, it the more it accommodates what the process called carbonation. So the CO2 dissolves into the droplets, so causing carbonation. So in order to achieve equilibrium, so apart from the mechanical side, so there has to be pressure, high pressure or high heat in order to enforce or to accelerate carbonation. Of course, there has to be saturation of CO2 levels. So the mere existence of the CO2 levels can induce partially some carbonation to the droplets. So as CO2 builds up due to the contraction brought by the phase shield, so the phase shield is actually stopping the CO2 particles from diffusing out. So it is retained and accumulated in that region. So therefore, carbonation is induced. So what happens when carbonation happens? So since carbonation happened, the acidity increases. So equilibrium is much faster. So to achieve the said equilibrium, the rate of achieving the equilibrium is related to the surface area to volume ratio. The smaller or the larger this ratio is, the faster the equilibrium state will be achieved. Therefore, if we look back into this equation here, the said ratio, which is inversely proportional to the droplets, meaning the smaller the droplets, the faster it is to equilibrate. So once carbonation happens, the acidity of the droplets increases even a bit. Of course, the main culprit to the faster carbonation are, as previously mentioned, are temperature and pressure. Of course, phase shields have an insulating effect. Apart from the said mechanical or the said mechanisms that I've previously discussed. So in terms of thermodynamics, it has phase shields have an insulating effect. So they trap heat. And since heat is one, how do you call this? Heat is one of the factors also leading to the evaporation rate. So as heat increases, so as the evaporation rate. So what are the implications in the increase of acidity? So as we have previously mentioned, if the evaporation rates became faster, the more droplets, the more acidity will be introduced to the droplets, or the more the droplets become acidic. So the more the droplets become acidic, the more it induces the opening of the spikes of COVID-19. So this is the spike, so the delta spike, which actually reaches out to the cells themselves, the intended receptors, and in turn, it increases the infectivity and the attack rate. So these researchers, if you look into the said YouTube video link below, since what do you call this? I'm still compiling the slides, so I have to refer to the other authors to do the job. So the spike proteins are actually affected by the acidity itself. So the changes of acidity led to, again, I'm just repeating what the author have said. So and actually, pH levels modulate infectivity. So paulit-ulit na lang. So that actually leads us to the correlation on why people wearing face shields tend to there's the wearing of the face shields actually relates to the tendency of being infected by COVID-19, and much worse in this doctor's situation where he advertised face shields. Of course, people are being tired of the mask mandate. For them, being enforced to do mask is just like a lockdown. Of course, as lockdowns have a different meaning. So meaning that you can't even go out, you cannot even go shopping, etc. But in contrast to them, lockdowns are you're obliged to wear masks in public. So for them, that's quite a suppression credit. Of course, they're so used to privileges and they're not that resilient. And they are itching to get rid of the said mask. And actually, the removal of the mask mandate in most Central European countries have caused the surge of COVID-19 being documented there recently. So to top on that, there's a new variant, Omicron. Hopefully, won't reach the Philippines, but of course, uh, vaccines are one thing, of course, that's to boost your body protection. But of course, we have to introduce engineering interventions or uh, controls to fully use physics to control actually the flow of the virus, to prevent the virus from being introduced to us in the first place. So what happened to this doctor is that in substitute for face shields, he decided to promote face in order to do away with the face mask, rather, apologies, uh, he decided to promote face shields. So he wore face shields in public events, and of course, that caused scrutiny among many of the public health experts. Public health experts in the UK are actually at war whether to recommend N95 mask, since in hospitals they are still mandated to wear surgical masks, so low low grade or low quality, somehow low quality when compared to the N95 mask. And and moving back to the story of the said doctor, he got COVID-19, most likely because of the said face shields, and actually he got the worst. The worst. I am not actually laughing at this situation. He got the worst end of the stick. He got long COVID, so COVID-19 with long-term implications. So he may be dumbfounded. Of course, there's ongoing debate whether COVID-19 is mainly airborne or mainly droplets. So maybe this doctor believe in droplets, since droplets are, he claimed that he's protecting people from the droplets he's supposedly emitting. When in fact COVID-19 is airborne, so there's no use when using when having those supposedly ballistic protection. Another incident, maybe uh, to put a nail deeper to the issue, about the increase of likeliness of getting COVID-19, is the case in Pontresina, Switzerland. So there's an hotel event there. So people attended. So some people wanted to do away with the mask. Of course, since mask muffles the conversation, so cause audibility issues, they try to find substitutes, and what the substitutes that they found is the contraption called face shield, and some people wore face shield, some people wore masks, and despite 1.5 meters social distancing, only all of those who wore only face shields got infected. So the likeliness of getting COVID-19 actually increases when you're wearing face shields. Of course, there's uh, many many studies being presented here. So I'll just skim through. So this is actually the paper that DOH and some of the face shield topologies are using in justification for the face shield mandate. So this is a meta-analysis by Derek Chu and his colleagues. This was actually funded by the World Health Organization. So since this is a meta-analysis, they compiled many studies, and they what they found, or rather, when they compiled those data, since they have known randomized control trials, and to evaluate whether these data are viable or in order to be counted as a randomized control trial, they evaluated what's called the risk of bias. So the risk of bias is the tendency of the other intervening factors or interventions actually influencing the results. And what they found using the new scale Ottawa scale and the Cochrane risk of bias, actually the said analysis of face shield and most of the studies being quoted here in the meta-analysis didn't satisfy the criteria for the risk of bias. So if we look at in this table here, so of course, somehow medical journals are verbal diarrhea, and they tend to overwhelm you with jargon. But if you look into the data, you can see the said interventions of physical distancing, face mask or no face mask, and eye protection. So what they found is that uh, in physical distancing, there's certainty. So meaning it somehow satisfies the risk of bias. However, for the use of face masks and face shields, or which are clustered together as eye protection along with goggles, they found that they evaluated that the certainty is low because in the first place, the risk of bias criterion uh, uh, are not being satisfied. So that's what actually the supposedly health experts are not communicating about when communicating about this research funded by the World Health Organization. So what happened actually in the paper is it's quite muddled because there's a meta-analysis, and an EBM expert here conducted meta-analysis of the said meta-analysis, uh, and he evaluated that there's some protection, and the protection was being reported or being carried over to the DOTR pamphlet. So the DOTR pamphlet is referring to the unpublished meta-analysis by the said EBM expert, and that EBM expert, when being interviewed in justifying the face shield mandate, actually quoted both his meta-analysis, Derek Hughes analysis, and the DOTR pamphlet itself. So somehow it's a circle of self-reference. Another study quoted, of course, both by uh, the the tropical disease expert and our infectious disease expert, is the study by Bhaskar in India. So this is among health workers. So they just documented the health workers going across communities, doing visits. Then there's a surge rate. There's a surge of infection. Then the said health workers experimented with the face shields, and somehow there's a reduction in infectivity. However, if you look into the said supposedly randomized control trial, it fails on the basis of what's called equipoise. So it's just like uh, taking a medicine, for example, that's intended to cure your cough, while wearing your, for example, uh, medallion, so one thing and thing. And you got better, and you actually attributed uh, you getting better to the medallion itself rather than to the medicine. So there's a greater intervention at hand in these scenarios, which is actually for Vascar's study, ventilation. And since when dealing with hospital settings, hospitals are being designed to have proper ventilation. So there's negative pressure rooms for COVID wards, etc. and etc. So in terms, rather I would stop at this presentation. So these were the actual experimentation being done for frontal emissions. So what Pan and her colleagues have determined is that face shields offer little to no protection. So it's a poor source control and also a poor protection against the aerosol droplets. And Fugaku, the supercomputer in Fukuoka University, actually evaluated that face shields are poor source control. So it's not actually stopping. It's just stopping the momentum, but it's not actually stopping the introduction of said airborne particles to the air. So the study from Florida Atlantic University determined that most of the droplets are being directed sideways and downwards rather than going to the front. So if we take into account all of those droplets, so all of those droplets are being still introduced into the air. So it's a poor source control. So another study which fails in equipoise also is a study by Wendling and colleagues, and also considered frontal emissions only, and of course they conceived this study on the basis of sporadic emissions. And this is the said study by Linsley, said study by Akagi, then the non-consideration of the other angles of attacks. And if you visualize, for example, the people wearing masks, so if there's a people are already wearing masks, what happens is that most of the airborne droplets are being directed towards back on the sides. So what's the use if we introduce face shields? example. So another clinical study was done by Salimia, Chopra and their colleagues that evaluated the protective effects of supposedly protective effects of face shields in conjunction with masks. So what they found out is when using face shields alone, it's not different when you're not wearing anything at all. If you're wearing face shields along with face masks, it's not different when you're wearing face masks alone. So that's their findings. So again, the neglected or the supposedly not accounted for aerosol generating procedures, which includes speaking and breathing. Then it's actually being incorporated to the medical field recently. So there's an ongoing paradigm shift, and this is Doc Jerry's presentation, and etc. And that will be all. So this is my summary so far. So I'll just recompile this, repackage this, and these were the references for the earlier slides. And that will be all. Maybe questions? Siguro? Raise na lang ng hands. Yun nga, yung sa iyo kasi ay yun nga, as I previously mentioned yung kay Akagi and et al na research. So we look back, siguro ilagay ko sa dulo. So yung kanilang their simulation, actually merong konting yaw. So even so, kahit merong yaw, meron pa ring vortex rings na nangyari. So regardless kung anong orientation siya, nangyari siya. And in wind engineering kung mapapansin mo, the more na oblique yung orientation ng object with respect dun sa wind tendency, mas malakas yung negative pressures, and yun nga, since mas malakas yung negative pressures, therefore mas na-amplify mo yung pressure diffusion. Raise na lang ng hand kung may tanong. Sige, sige, go ahead. Say your questions. Say your question pala. Sige, unahin muna natin yung kay Sir James Martinez na question. Pwede ka nang mag-unmute? Yes. Hello? Okay. Sige. Sige, while Mr. Martinez is doing his questions, let's entertain Reynaldo Peña's question. So what's the assumed volatility of airflow encompass the range of outdoor and indoor average conditions regardless if there's aircon or not. So what matters actually in these situations is relative humidity. So kung humid yung ambient environment mo, edi magiging less volatile, mas magiging behave yung flow. So we look back to some slides. This is what actually Wang and his colleagues have observed. So if relative humidity is 90, and there's if we say as there's low relative humidity, so there's high difference, mas nagiging saturated, and the more na merong equilibrium ng humidity between dun sa emission at saka dun sa environment tendency, the more na nagko-coagulate yung mga smaller droplets, nagiging larger droplets siya, and then tendency nagpo-fall na lang siya dun sa ground. So the more na malaki yung differential ng humidity ng emission dun sa environment, the more na mas naging diffusive siya. Hence, kaya nga nasasabi na mas natatransmit siya indoors kaysa outdoors. Kasi outdoors nga, mas mabilis mag-balance yung humidity unlike kapag indoors na hindi, merong differential and kakaroon ng mixing. Yung sa speed ng CAF, meron akong research na kinote dun sa sinasubmit kong journal and hindi naman siya na-pulled out of the blue. May tanong pa ba? Kasi naman, dapat mag-unmute na lang. Lungkot naman magbasa ng questions. If, may tanong pa po ba? So if none, ayun. Okay lang. If there are no questions or gusto pang humabol, perhaps later you can actually reach me out via email. Email nyo lang ako. Merong questions. And actually, the full technical presentation, again, will be presented perhaps dun sa environmental engineering na conference. And it will also be elaborated fully sa isang plenary talk sa Honor Society of Mapua in December 11. And I would also like to invite you guys sa workshop na inorganize ng Prime HPC. So that was under EEE, Institute of So EEI. So baka mamali pa ako ng tawag sa institute. So sila nagpa-organize on how to simulate airborne transmission. So kung gusto niyo mag-design halimbawa ng ventilation systems or kung gusto niyo ma-optimize halimbawa yung airflow dun sa isang room against airborne transmissions, airborne COVID-19, I would recommend na umattend kayo dun sa workshop na yun. And it's actually Electrical and Electronics Engineering Institute. So thank you, Mr. Peñas, for the clarification. And yun nga, the first part will be the technical part. So i-discuss doon on how to simulate using transport equation and Lagrangian particle tracking. So yung Lagrangian particle tracking is a four-way multi-phase flow analysis. So pati yung droplets mismo, dinedetermine mo, pero syempre maglalahad din ako ng limitations kung bakit sa second part ng lecture mo or magpo-focus tayo dun sa transport equation. So hands-on na yung second part ng lecture, which is on December 17. If there are no questions again, maraming salamat sa mga umattend, and recorded naman tong lecture na to, and yun nga, i-upload na lang sa YouTube, and hopefully kung may gusto pang humabol ng nood and ng questions, syempre nga via email and via YouTube na lang. So with that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much and have a pleasant afternoon and evening. And of course, stay safe guys. Syempre, medyo nagbabanta na naman isang mas deadlier na variant. Thank you.